This is Ellen Shemitz. I'm the Executive Director of Connecticut Voices for Children, and I'm here with our Associate Fiscal Policy Fellow, Ray Noonan, to talk to you about the state economy, the state budget, and the state of our children. Today, we are going to talk about a series of different issues and different developments, all of which will have a significant impact on the work that we face going forward as we seek to ensure opportunity for all the children across our state. We're going to begin with a discussion of the state economy. We'll talk about some long-term trends, disparate impact, and how changes in the economy have impacted vulnerable children and families, and the future implications of those changes. We will then move to a discussion of the state budget, talking specifically about the causes of the slowing revenue, the challenges of an upside down tax system where we ask more of those with the least, the challenges of increasing liabilities and particularly the non-functional expenses, and finally, how all of this has created an austerity mindset that is making it far more challenging to advocate for fair, equitable investments in children. We'll then talk about how our children doing. Specifically, we'll look at the changes over time and how the state serves and invests in child well-being. And we'll look at how changes at the federal level are impacting the state ability to invest moving forward. We'll then talk about some new fiscal restrictions, specifically 4 different structural changes that were made to the budget in the last session and what those mean in terms of the ability for Connecticut to move forward, to become more competitive with other states, and to move towards a more inclusive and shared prosperity. And then we'll talk about solutions, how it is we actually can start to turn the tide and move the state in a more encouraging direction. To start us off talking about the state of the economy, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Ray Noonan. Before I do that, just a few housekeeping details. This presentation should last around 45 minutes, after which time we've reserved another 10 to 15 minutes for your questions. The way these YouTube webinars work, you'll be able to type in your questions. You should see a space for that on the right side of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, we'll pick up those questions, read them back to you, and try to answer them as best we can. And it's now my pleasure to give the mic over to Ray Noonan.
Hi, Ellen. Thanks for that introduction. So we're going to start off by talking about the state economy. And as Ellen said, we're going to talk about the long-term trends, the disparate impact of those trends, and future implications for our state. So one of the important things to note about Connecticut's economy is that there's been a shift over the past year, 10 to 15 years, and especially there's been a shift since our recovery from the Great Recession, and that the recovery has left too many families behind. This is a chart where you can see the change in the number of jobs that we considered low wage, mid wage, and high wage over the past 5 years from 2011 to 2016. And you can see that the number of low wage jobs in this state, you think restaurant workers, Walmart, and so on, has increased by 8.5%, whereas the number of jobs that we classified as mid or high wage, the jobs that provide enough security and financial stability to raise a family, have decreased. Now, this has implications for spending since there's increased need in the state, for revenue since there's less taxable income, and also for economic growth since there's not only less money being spent in communities, but often these low-wage jobs have less fiscal stability for our state. And also, when you look at a broader sense, the total number of jobs, you can see that we're actually not doing much better than we were 20 years ago. So you see that the total number of jobs we have in Connecticut is about the same it was in 2000 and is in fact lower than it was than its pre-recession peak in March 2008. We have around 40,000 less jobs than we did in March 2008. And not only has job growth been slow since the recession, our recovery has been slower than our peer states. So you can see this is a chart where the number of jobs in Each state has been indexed to 100 in June 2009, right after the recession ended. And you can see that since the recession ended, Massachusetts has seen the greatest job growth with around 13% increased jobs compared to the end of the recession, closely followed by New York, then Rhode Island and New Jersey, and finally Connecticut in last place with just 3% more jobs than we had at the end of the recession. And number of jobs is not the only economic indicator you can see this trend in. You can also see it in state GDP. Now, GDP is the value of everything produced by all the people and all the companies in Connecticut. And you can see that in 2007, at our peak, we were making around, or our GDP was around $247 billion. And in 2016, that hasn't recovered to pre recession levels. We're only at around $230 billion. And when you compare this to other states, you see once again that Connecticut is in last place among our peers. You can see that compared to the end of the recession in 2009, you see that Massachusetts has had GDP growth of around 16%, followed by New York, followed by Rhode Island and New Jersey, and finally Connecticut in last place, which has not recovered its GDP to the level it was right at the end of the recession. But it's also really important to note that in some ways, Connecticut's economic recovery has left people of color behind. Now you can see here, for instance, here's the chart of the wage disparities between Black and white workers and Latino and white workers, respectively, from 2011 to 2016. And you can see the gap in wages between Black workers and white workers has increased from around $7 an hour in 2011 to around $10 an hour in 2016. Similarly, you can see that the wage gap between Latino and white workers is still around $9 to $10 an hour, so still much, much, much too high. And also, it's also important to say that the disparities in Connecticut are not purely financial and they extend to other parts of life, such as health. You can see here, for instance, that rates of health uninsurance among residents in Connecticut differs by color. So you could see, for instance, although white residents have an uninsurance rate of around 3%, for Latino residents, that's around 12%. And similarly, for Black residents, their rates of uninsurance are around double that of white residents. I do think it's important to note here that thanks to the Affordable Care Act, disparities in uninsurance rates by race has decreased, but this is at threat thanks to efforts at the federal level to dismantle the act. Another area of life in Connecticut where you can see great disparities by race is education. You can see, for instance, Black and Latino students in Connecticut make almost 3/4 of preschool to second grade suspensions, and Black students are 4 times more likely in K-12 to be suspended than their white peers. This not only has moral implications for Connecticut, but it also has economic implications. The children growing up today are the workforce of tomorrow, and the workforce of tomorrow is going to be much more diverse than it is today. You can see here in a chart of the percent of Connecticut's 3 and 4-year-olds who are of color is almost a majority. It probably will be a majority in the next few years. And if we allow this high poverty, these other disparities to go unchecked, we're going to pay the price in terms of workforce preparedness for the future. So all these factors and more in the state economy have really driven a lot of trends in the state budget, some of which you've seen in the last few years, these large deficits, and we're going to get into some other factors that have affected the state budget over the last few years. One of the most important is that revenue growth in Connecticut is slowing and is slowing dramatically. You can see here, here's a chart of year-over-year revenue growth in Connecticut over the past 10 to 15 years. You can see in the early 2000s, we were averaging revenue growth of around 7 to 8% a year. Sometimes it would be 6 or 5%. But since the recession largely, or since 2012, 2013, it's really been more at 1 or 2% per year. And even when you look at 2017, 2018, 2019, the most recent years, we've actually even seen decreases in revenue. So even though costs have been increasing, even though need has been increasing, the amount of revenue we've been able to get to meet those needs has decreased, and that's caused big deficits. And it's besides this revenue growth point because the growth both in the economy and in our revenue sources has huge, huge implications for our budget. You can see here, here's a chart comparing the revenue growth after the 2001 recession to after the great, more recent recession in 2008. And you can see 7 years after the 2001 recession, Connecticut was bringing in around 40% more personal income tax revenue than it was in 2001. whereas 7 years after the Great Recession, Connecticut was only bringing in 10% more revenue. And that difference, that 30% difference between 143 and 110, is about $3 billion that Connecticut would have been bringing in fiscal year 2015. There's also been some issues with the personal income tax. You can see that there's been deviations between what we've expected to bring in and what we've actually brought in. So you could see here in the early mid 2000s, during the years when everything was great, you could see that we were bringing in that the amount of personal income tax revenue that we actually brought in was higher than what we expected. Whereas since the recession, it's been consistently less. You can see in 2016 and 2017, it's been as much as 5 or 6% less than when you expected to bring in. And that's millions and millions of dollars that the state thought it could spend and then didn't, or couldn't, I should say. There are other more systemic problems with our revenue system in Connecticut. And you can see, for instance, here that the sales tax revenue in Connecticut has decreased as a share of personal income. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but the big takeaway here is that the sales tax in Connecticut is a goods-based sales tax. It taxes Blockbuster, but it doesn't tax Netflix. It does not tax the services and the internet sales that are becoming a larger and larger part of the state economy. Furthermore, you can see that corporate tax breaks are increasing. In 2002, we were spending around $660 million on corporate tax breaks, and in 2017, last year, we spent around $700 million. And as these tax breaks have increased, until very recently, there hasn't been the type of oversight and transparency needed to see whether these are worth their return on investment. We also look at our property tax system. Our property tax system in Connecticut is upside down. That is, the people who have the least often have to pay the most. You can see here's a chart of effective property tax rates versus income decile. And you can see that the people at the lowest end of the income scale are often paying the highest property tax rates, often in excess of 12%. And this has a color. You can see that our property tax system furthers racial disparities. Black residents in Connecticut tend to pay on average about 2.7, 2.8% of their property value in property taxes, whereas white residents pay around 2.1%. And it's not just our property tax system that's upside down, but it's actually our entire tax system. This is from the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy, and you can see that the taxpayers in Connecticut who have the lowest income often pay the highest taxes, state and local taxes in the state. You can see that, for instance, the lowest 20% of taxpayers, those who make less than $25,000 a year, are paying 10.5% of their income in taxes, whereas the top 1%, those making over 1.3 million, are paying just 5% of their income in taxes. So that's a bit about the revenue side. Let's talk a bit about liabilities and spending. So as you all know, we have a large budget deficit. We've had systemic budget deficits in Connecticut for some time, and you'll often hear that this is a spending problem, that we're spending too much money on all these different services and middle management or whatnot. And if we just cut all that, if we just cut spending, then we wouldn't have a budget deficit. And this just doesn't hold up to the facts of the data. You can see here, this is a chart that shows the average amount of increases in government spending since 1996. You can see in the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, government spending was increasing by around 5% per year. In the mid to late 2000s, it was increasing by about 4% per year. And since 2010, 2011, government spending has increased only at around 2.3% per year. This is lower than it's been historically. Spending can't explain all the changes or all the deficits that we've been having and the magnitude of those deficits in the last few years. But there is one area where spending has increased dramatically, and it's really important to highlight, and that's our liabilities, our pension, our debt, our pensions, our debt, our retiree health care. So this is a chart of the State Employee Retirement System, or SERS, and if you talk to us before May 2017, or I guess before December 2016, you'd have seen that red line. That is the projected contributions we would have had to make to SERS over the next 15 years. So right now it's at around $2 billion. It would have increased to around $4 billion and then dropped off dramatically after 2032. Now, that increase by $2 billion is around 10% of the state budget. That would have been a huge increase. So state policymakers and the unions came together and decided to flatten out that plan. So we wouldn't have as large of a peak. It would be around $2 billion, peaking in around 2024-ish, but it would be pay it for a longer period of time. That's the green line. It'd go out to around 2047. Now, so that's one component of our liabilities that was addressed in May, but there are other components. For instance, TRS, the Teachers Retirement System, is a problem that has not been addressed, and it's going to be increasing dramatically over the next few years. You can see here that so this graph right here is what the state assumes the teachers' retirement system is going to look like over the next 15 years. So it doesn't look that bad, right? It's only increasing from around $1 billion to not even $2 billion. The problem is that this relies on a rate of return of around 8.5% per year. We haven't gotten 8.5% per year in the last, 5 to 10 years. If we actually go to a more realistic 5.5% return, you can see this giant peak from around $1.5 billion right now to nearly $6 billion in 2032. That would be an increase of around 400% over that time period. So this is increasing dramatically. We're only at the beginning of it. It's actually going to get worse before it gets better. So we've talked a bit about the liabilities. Let's talk about the impact that these liabilities could have on both the budget and a bit on the mindset of the state. So we've been doing some work with the Yale Law School trying to project what the effects of these different budget policies are going to have on the state over the next 10 to 15 years. And right now, we're currently estimating that the growth of these non-functional costs are going to cause a $2.8 billion deficit by 2030, unless there's something changes. So there's really a need for deep structural changes to the state economy or to our budgeting practices. And I think it's also very important to talk about a bit about the austerity mindset that's sort of taken hold in the state and the consequences it's had for children and families. So you could see there's been a lot of different ways, if you look at the latest budget that just passed, on what we're calling the austerity mindset. That is, you've already seen that the state's tax system is upside down, and yet we're increasing taxes on low to middle income families. You've seen how it's not a spending problem, and yet we've been increasing, or not sure if we've been increasing, but we have been accelerating spending cuts over the last few years. For instance, you can see that we've reduced the Earned Income Tax Credit, one of the most effective programs against poverty, by $35 million a year, increasing taxes for low-income families. We've been restricting the property tax credit, which is going to cost middle-class taxpayers in Connecticut by $55 million a year. But at the same time we're doing these programs, we're also cutting the estate tax for the very wealthiest. And in fact, I would say $15.6 million right there is actually an underestimate of how it's going to affect the long term, not only because of federal changes, but also because this program is being phased in over time. And this austerity mindset hasn't worked. In fact, if you look at our current budget deficit and the budget deficit that's predicted for the next few years, the legislature's own fiscal policy office predicts that we're going to have a $4.4 billion deficit in the next two fiscal years, in fiscal years 20 and 2021, which is $900 million more than the gap they faced last fall. So the budget that passed last fall really sort of just kicked the can down the road to the next legislators. And not only that, but it hasn't even solved the problem for the current fiscal year. You know, the current fiscal year is around $220 million out of balance, and next year's budget is around $40 million out of balance. So still a lot of work to be done. Austerity budgeting clearly isn't the solution. So now I'm going to pass it over to Ellen Shemus, who's going to talk about the consequences of these policies for children and families.
Thank you, Ray. So as Ray noted, we're seeing a lot of big picture trends with changes in the economy and the way that impacts the families, the budgets of families across the state, and the way it impacts the budget of the state itself as it seeks to move forward with its priorities. We want to talk now about how these big pressures are impacting children and families in a more direct way. And we want to start by talking about relative state spending. Ray spoke in some detail about the dramatic increase in non-functional costs over the past decade or so. Non-functional costs, again, include things like pensions, retired health care for both teachers, state workers, teachers' retirement, and debt service. And if you look at this graph, you can see that those costs have increased by close to 30% in little over a decade. During that same period of time, there's been a dramatic decrease in what we spend on children. And in fact, if you go back a full 20 years, you can see that we used to spend nearly 40% of the entire state budget on programs and services that supported the growth and well-being of children and families. Fast forward to today, and just this past session, for the first time ever, after a steady decrease in the rate of investment, we actually have dipped for the first time below 30% of the state budget being devoted to children and families. And we're looking with the new budget to actually dropping below 28%. To put those numbers and that chart in context, I want to give you some examples or remind you of some of the ways and some of the areas cuts have been made. So just this session, we have already changed eligibility for Medicaid that will result in forcing 9,500 parents off of Medicaid. And that is on top of the 18,000 who lost coverage back when the rates or the eligibility was changed in 2015. That decreasing line also reflects cuts to higher education, including reductions in scholarships for low-income students and a rather dramatic 13% cut to UConn. It represents cuts to regional vocational technical schools. It represents cuts to the ECS or education grants to towns and municipalities. It represents cuts to Head Start, to a two-generation initiative, to Help Me Grow child development triage and referral service. And as Ray mentioned earlier, it also represents cuts on the revenue side of the budget in terms of restricting tax credits in a way that takes money out of the hands of families. So there's been a reduction in the earned income tax credit down from 27.5% of the federal rate or the federal tax credit to 23%, resulting in $35 million a year being taken out of the pockets of low-income working families, and the $55 million a year hit in terms of restrictions on the property tax credit. So at the same time as we are providing fewer services, dramatically fewer services, we're also taking more money out of the pockets of low-income working families. This next graph may be one of the most disturbing in admittedly, in a series or in a webinar that has a rather large number of admittedly disturbing slides. This scissor graph shows the relative increase in non-functional costs as a percentage of overall state spending and contrasts it with the overall decrease in the percentage of state spending that goes to support children and families. In other words, as we spend more and more money trying to account for debt that was accumulated over a long time, we are investing less and less in our own future and in the talent and in the possibilities that our children will be able to truly contribute to the future prosperity of the state. These shifting priorities at the state level are being exacerbated by threats and challenges that are coming down from the federal level. There's been a great deal of tension recently to the changes in terms of tax reform. And this slide just gives you a snapshot showing how the change in the federal tax structure that was just enacted at the end of the 2017 will exacerbate the already upside down tax structure that Ray spoke about. So if you look at the red lines, that shows you, well, actually, let's begin with the gray lines. The gray lines show you what's going to happen to benefit of this tax cut when we project out to 2027. At that point, we'll actually see an increase in taxes on low income, and we'll see we'll see an increase in taxes in the low income while we see a continued decrease in taxes on the highest income. In the shorter time period right now, while there will be some tax cuts that are enjoyed by all, the vast majority of those tax cuts will go to those who are in the wealthiest 5%. But of even more concern is the fact that as a part of this tax bill, there was a dramatic reduction on the amount of state taxes that families can deduct from their federal tax return. So the state and local tax deductions, known as SALT, are now limited to $10,000 per return. For Connecticut residents, and indeed for residents of other northeastern states that have very high property taxes and to some extent higher overall taxes than some of the southern states, this means that there is going to be a sense that our taxes are going up even though there's no change at the state level. But the loss of that deduction, or a good portion of that deduction, will make the overall impact feel as if taxes are going up. And that's going to create downward pressure in terms of the ability of state legislators to recommend increases in revenue, so that while we see a downward pressure on investment in children and families, we're also feeling a downward pressure on any effort to raise revenue to reverse that challenge. And it continues to get worse. Into the tax changes at the federal level, we know that those tax changes are going to create a dramatic deficit, which we have been told will be redressed in large part by cuts to entitlements. Now, Connecticut receives about 20% of its budget from federal funding, and that is for over $4.5 billion in Medicaid funding, almost $780 million in SNAP nutrition funding, $62 million in terms of the Children's Health Insurance Program. And the chart that you can see on the screen shows you different line items, large blocks of money that the state receives from the federal government and used to support critical programs and services. If indeed the federal government is going to respond to the deficit that it's created, then we are going to feel that in terms of fewer federal funds and increased pressure on the state and local government to fill the gap, to fill the need that is left. So, we see a long-term trend that's harming or reducing the relative investment in children and families. We see new downward pressures created at the federal level, but we also see some new challenges at the state level that were created in the last budget that was passed this fall, in the form of structural changes that were intended to reform and improve the budget process, but because of the way they were drafted, have actually put the well-being of the state at risk. And there are four budget restrictions that were created. There was a redefinition of the constitutional spending cap. There was the creation of a volatility cap. There was the creation of a bond cap, and then there was the creation of a bond lock. And we want to speak briefly about each of them. So many of you have heard about the spending cap. You know that it was enacted in 1991 as a part of a broad compromise when the income tax was introduced. And the spending cap essentially says we want to make sure that even if there is a lot of revenue coming into the state, that we don't spend it willy-nilly, that indeed we have a restriction on the increase in spending that is permissible year over year. And the spending cap applies to certain parts of the state budget or certain parts of the general budget expenditure. Over the years, there has been difficulty coming to consensus about what parts of the state budget should be covered or limited by the spending cap. But in the past, in this most recent budget, there was a vote that gave real definition to general budget expenditures in a way that actually expanded the scope of the spending cap and increased those areas of state spending that are limited. There were two big changes. It brought under the cap support to distressed municipalities, and it brings pension funding under the cap. This increased definition or increased scope of the spending cap means that for the 2019 budget, we can only spend 1% more in our general fund expenditures than we spent in the 2018 budget. That's about 200 million. That's all the room we have to increase our expenditures, increase our investments. Now, it's important to remember that this limitation is based upon a base budget that's already a very austere, stripped down budget. So, if you think about some of the limitations that we're working with in the 2016 budget, we eliminated Medicaid for 20,000 parents. We reduced the property tax credit. We cut over 130 million from K to 12 education. If we simply tried to, in 2019, return to 2016 expenditure levels, we would use almost all of the room that's available under the cap, preventing us from making any affirmative new investments or investing any affirmative new programs going forward. But it actually gets a little bit worse than that. If you looked at this chart, you may recall that Ray showed it to you earlier, and it shows the increases in the teachers' retirement system if we assume a 5.5 rate of return. And you can see that by 2032, it jumps dramatically to $6 billion. Well, according to the compromise that was reached in the spending cap definition, the CBAC, the state worker pensions, will come under the spending cap in 2023, which is not all that problematic, but the TRS payments will come under in 2027. And if you look at the red line on this slide, you'll see that there is a rather significant gap between the time when pension spendings or pension contributions will be brought under the cap and when they spike. And that difference is about $4 billion. So, unless there are significant changes, maybe changes in the market that actually dramatically bring us up to a really high rate of return, then in order to bring this money under the cap, we're going to have to cut up to about $4 billion in other line items. I pause there simply to let you digest that. What else has been done in terms of structural reform? Well, there was a volatility cap that was created. Now, to be clear, volatility caps are a very good policy idea. What they say is when you're dealing with income from an income tax, we know that there's a fair amount of volatility. Income tax are famously the most volatile of all state revenue. And so, in order to ensure that states aren't caught unprepared in years when revenue is below what was expected, we have to have a rainy day fund from which we can pull in years where there is scarcity. Volatility cap says anytime there is more revenue from the income tax that you anticipated, that needs to go into a rainy day fund to be there for scarcity years. In general, a good idea, particularly because if you look at the Connecticut state budget, you'll see that the majority of state revenue, 51%, comes from income taxes. So volatility there is dangerous. I do want to be clear that the limitation on the volatility cap or the limitation on the money that comes in isn't with respect to all of the income tax revenue. It's only with respect to what's called estimates and finals, so about 19% of the returns. If you think about it, the withholdings, the personal income tax withholdings, represent what you and I pay, what comes out of our paycheck every week. The estimates and finals come from income derived from stocks, corporations, and so on. They're taxes that are paid by the wealthiest in our society, and they are the ones that have the most volatility. If this volatility cap only applied as intended to unexpected changes in estimates and finals from income tax revenue, that would represent best practice policy. Unfortunately, the way the volatility cap language was drafted, it actually applies to all increases in revenue from estimates and finals, meaning that If the state were to decide that it wanted to increase the marginal rate on income tax revenues in order to bring in more revenue, in order to ensure that we can invest in children and families, the money that was raised from that progressive tax would not go into the general fund, would not be available that year for appropriations, but instead would have to go into the rainy day fund. What that means is that because of the overly broad crafting of the volatility cap, the only way the state can raise revenue in the short term is not from a progressive tax, but rather would be to resorting to other taxes, for example, the sales tax or perhaps some form of statewide property tax, which are overall regressive taxes. So it takes the opportunity for progressive taxation off the table moving forward. What else? Well, there's a bond cap. The state, in addition to the spending cap and in addition to the volatility cap, also put a limit on how much borrowing the state can do moving forward. Existing law already limits the total amount of general fund debt that the legislature can authorize. We've actually put in new limitations that are far lower, a $2 billion cap for 2017 and a little bit lower in 2018. This means that we are not going to be in the position to borrow money to do things like school construction, road repair, school repair, IT infrastructure. One of the conversations that we've been having on a regular basis across Connecticut is the importance of making our state economically competitive, making it attractive to businesses. And part of what makes states attractive to businesses is a vital and a safe infrastructure. If we can't invest in our roads and our bridges and our IT because we can't borrow the money to do that, that is going to be a restraint on our growth. Which brings us to the bond lock. The bond lock is the worst of the four restraints that was created. Essentially, what the bond lock is a requirement that for any bond that the state issues as of May 15th, 2018 forward, there has to be a provision, a covenant, that the state will not make any changes in those three caps we just discussed, the spending cap, the volatility cap, and the bond cap for the life of the bond that is issued. And those bonds are 10-year bonds. That means that if the state realized we must make investments in our transportation, it is absolute imperative for the well-being of the state, and we have to borrow money to do that. The bond lock would prevent the state from doing that, even if a unanimous legislature wanted to. If the state decided that it wanted to dramatically increase funding to education, to distressed municipalities, because it realizes that we need to invest in the education of all of our children, and most particularly those children who are in disadvantaged towns and communities. Even with a unanimous legislature, it would not be able to do that. While there are some escape clauses that would allow for exemptions or working around the bond lock in any individual year, those are 1-year only escape clauses and would not allow for a broad revision of any of these three. What that means is we have to fix the bond lock now. That for those of us who are invested in the long-term well-being of the state, whether you be a child advocate or a business owner or anyone who believes that our state needs to be able to move forward and make affirmative investments, strategic investments, we have to fix the bond lock this year. Okay. Ray and I have given you some somewhat depressing, I admit, information with respect to changes and challenges in the economy and in our budget. But we want to shift gears a little bit now and point out to you that not all is dark, that we have a state with tremendous assets to build upon, and that if we can simply build the political will and energy to move forward, there are solutions. And the solutions that we want to talk about are grounded in two core values: the value of equity, that everyone in this state deserves the opportunity to reach to meet their full potential, and opportunity, that if we give everyone that opportunity to reach their full potential, it'll be good not only for those individuals, but for the entire state, as We depend less on the safety net and indeed find that our citizens are able to contribute more on a regular basis to the well-being of the state, leading us to more extended prosperity and more inclusive prosperity. So, just what are these ideas of pathways to opportunity? We group them in three areas. We talk about the need for investments that'll drive inclusive economic growth. We talk about the need for investments that'll support the potential of children and families. And we talk about the need for investments that'll drive equity and excellence in education. The idea of an opportunity agenda, opening doors to opportunity, pathways to opportunity, is a response to the austerity frame. And it is a reaction or it is a reflection of the reality that we cannot cut our way out of the current situation, that we do need to make strategic investments to grow our way out of what is, in fact, a structural deficit, and that to grow our way out, we need to prioritize the kind of inclusive economic growth that will benefit everyone. And by benefiting individuals across the state, we actually will benefit the overall economic picture. When we advance these ideas, we don't advance them in a vacuum, and we don't advance them from the limited perspective of child advocates. In fact, the kinds of solutions that we are advocating are solutions that are consistent with those that many business leaders have supported. There was a forum, wow, it must be a good year ago now, that was almost a year ago. It was in February of 2017. Uh, there was a forum talking about why GE and Aetna had decided to leave the state. And there was a discussion of, is it because of the tax structure in the state? And in fact, what those business leaders agreed upon at the forum was no. The primary reason businesses considered leaving wasn't because of taxes, but was because of the lack of a long term strategic plan and commitment to investments in the kind of infrastructure that's necessary for success. So Ann Klee spoke at that, and she is the vice president of GE. And she stated very clearly, until you fix the roads and the public transportation system and the airports, it's very hard to say that Fairfield County is a good place for a large multinational company. The summary of the GE report read, instead of constantly addressing short term budget crises, the state must show long term fiscal responsibility, which includes investing in cities, in transportation, and in education, and must have a reasonably positive budgetary outlook. So, our last slide here before we open it up for questions tries to spell out in a little bit more detail what we call an opportunity agenda, which we hope all of you will adopt and advocate for. And it talks about, what does it mean to drive inclusive economic growth? Well, we have to fix, in the first instance, the fiscal restraints we talked about so that we're allowed to grow. We have to modernize our tax code so that it's no longer upside down, so it adapts to a service economy, so we have adequate and fair revenue that'll support strategic investments. As part of the same effort, we need to examine and evaluate our business tax breaks just as we evaluate other spending. And the result will be an equitable, an adequate, a transparent, and a sustainable revenue system that can be part of a long term economic development and growth plan. In terms of our children and families, we have to focus on prevention rather than intervention. We certainly need to protect CHIP and Medicaid, ensure that our most vulnerable children are protected, and move away from incarceration, rather to empowering youth and enabling youth to reach their full potential. And finally, in education, if you speak to any business person, they will tell you that the two key ingredients for a successful business environment are transportation systems and talent. We need to invest in early childhood education. We need to invest in equitable education across every town and city. And we need to ensure that all of our youth graduate high school, college, and career ready. Those are our priorities. We hope that you share them with us. Before I open it up for questions, and I'm assuming that we do have some questions here, I'm just looking over to our communications director who will bring up those questions in a moment. But I want to mention that the work that we're doing, the fiscal work that we're doing, would not be possible without some very generous support from three key foundations who have made a tremendous difference in terms of our capacity and ability to speak out on behalf of the need for a longer term, more competitive business structure, tax structure that'll support inclusive prosperity. Those foundations are the Stoneman Family Foundation, the Grossman Family Foundation, and Melville Charitable Trust. And now I just want to pause a moment and ask our communications director to pull up the questions, which would require me putting glasses on. So this question is the public sector, this is how it reads, the question. The public sector is the largest employer of Blacks and women. Have you examined the connection between wage benefit cuts and layoffs of state municipal employees and racial disparities in income? And I'm going to give the microphone to Ray Noonan to answer this. Ray is the author of the latest State of Work in Connecticut, and he can talk a little bit about that.
Hi, thanks for your question. The answer is no, although it's something, although we are, I should say, it's something we are concerned about, and we are certainly concerned about the loss of state and municipal employees over the last few years, especially with these budget cuts.
Well, either we answered every possible question, or we depressed you completely, or I'm going to assume those are the only two possibilities because we maybe just answered everything. That's our hope. If you do have questions, they may be answered in person because we hope you'll be joining us on January 30th, where we will be holding our annual budget forum at the State House. There's more information about that forum on our website, and you can sign up on our website. We really want to thank you for your time this morning. We hope the webinar has been informative, and we look forward to engaging with each of you, to working with each of you as we try to move the state forward towards a time when there is true opportunity for every child to meet their full potential and to help make Connecticut a truly prosperous, inclusive, and equitable state. Thank you all.